Wyatt Calloway once kept an old Navy box in his garage, the way other men kept the last shred of their honor. To his ex-wife, it was nothing but a rotted wooden crate that smelled of salt and old poverty. Brielle sold it for $20 in front of the neighbors, and her new fiancé laughed that Wyatt's junk had finally been worth something, at least a lunch. 3 days later, a billionaire stepped out of a gleaming black car, laid a check for $5 million on the table, and said he needed that box back today. If you love stories where quiet people get the last word and buried secrets finally surface, stay until the end, because this one earns every twist it gives you. The town of Harbor Bend sat along the coast of Maine where the fog rolled in most mornings before the fishing boats went out, and Wyatt Calloway had lived there his whole life without ever once trying to leave it. He worked as a marine mechanic at a small marina on the edge of the harbor, the kind of place where wealthy boat owners paid him well, but never learned his last name. He was a single father raising his daughter June, mostly through phone calls and weekend visits, since the divorce had left him with less time and even less money, though never less love. He was not a man who spoke about his past, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he had learned that some things sound smaller once other people get their hands on them. In the garage of the small rented house he used to share with Brielle, there sat a navy chest made of solid oak, its metal edges rusted at the corners, its surface stamped faintly with the words W. Calloway, Harbor Light, 1981. Wyatt had never let anyone open it carelessly, not even during the marriage, and Brielle had once called it his shrine to a father who was never even famous. To Wyatt, it was not a shrine. It was the only thing left of his father, Silas Calloway, a former Navy technician whose name had quietly disappeared from every official record after a disaster 4 decades earlier that nobody in Harbor Bend liked to discuss. Wyatt had grown up hearing fragments of his father's story rather than the whole of it, small pieces dropped at kitchen tables or muttered by older men at the diner who still remembered the name Calloway and lowered their voices when they said it. His mother had passed when he was young, and Silas had raised him largely alone, working odd repair jobs around the harbor after the Navy quietly let him go, never once explaining exactly why. Wyatt remembered his father's hands more than his father's words, calloused and steady, the same hands that had once, according to rumor, been trusted with equipment worth more than the entire town combined. When Silas died, he left behind almost nothing except that chest, a compass, and an instruction, spoken only once, that Wyatt was never to sell it, never to open it for strangers, and never to let anyone convince him it was worthless. That instruction had shaped the quiet architecture of Wyatt's adult life more than he had ever admitted to Brielle during their marriage. He worked long hours at the marina, not because he loved boats particularly, but because the work was honest and it let him keep his evenings free for June, the daughter who had become the center of whatever future he still believed in. His co-workers at the marina respected him without knowing much about him, and that suited Wyatt fine, since he had learned early that people tended to treat a man differently once they decided his past made him either pitiful or dangerous. Brielle Hartman came back to the old house one afternoon to collect a few remaining belongings, accompanied by her new fiancé Preston Vale, a small-time real estate broker who wore suits slightly too expensive for his actual bank account. Preston looked at Wyatt the way some men look at anyone who fixes engines for a living, as though grease under the fingernails were proof of failure rather than skill. Brielle noticed the old chest sitting in the corner of the garage, taking up space, gathering dust, and irritating her simply by existing. Wyatt was at work that day, and he had told her clearly, more than once, never to touch that box under any circumstance. She decided otherwise. She had spent years listening to Wyatt speak about his father in careful, guarded sentences, and she had grown tired of watching him treat a wooden crate like it held something sacred. So when the neighborhood yard sale came around that weekend, she carried the chest out to the driveway herself, set it beside the folding tables of old dishes and children's toys, and placed a small handwritten sign on the lid that read simply, $20. The yard sale filled the driveway with the usual mid-morning crowd, retirees looking for bargains, a young couple furnishing their first apartment, and a scattering of neighbors who had known Wyatt and Brielle since before the marriage fell apart. Brielle told anyone who asked that the box belonged to her ex-husband, a man who still clung to some old idea that his Navy father mattered, when in her opinion the past should stay buried where it belonged. Preston stood beside her, laughing along, telling one neighbor the box probably held nothing but moth-eaten socks, a few fake medals, and photographs too faded to matter to anyone. He said Wyatt held on to the past because the present had given him so little else to be proud of, and a few people chuckled, not because it was clever, but because cruelty dressed as humor often gets a laugh it does not deserve. An older man named Ethan Pruitt happened to be walking past on his way back from the hardware store, the owner of a modest antiques shop 2 streets over that mostly sold chipped china and second-hand furniture. He paused at the chest, running his fingers along the hinges, noticing something the casual eye would miss: a maker's stamp pressed faintly into the metal from a shipyard that had done contract work for the Navy decades earlier. It was not the kind of hinge you found on ordinary military surplus, and something about its weight told him this was not simply decorative junk. He asked Brielle the price, and she told him $20, adding that she would take even less just to see it gone from her sight. Preston joked that if Ethan paid $25 instead of $20, they might finally break what he called the Callaway curse a little faster, and Brielle laughed along, delighted at her own small cruelty. A few of the neighbors exchanged glances rather than laughter, the kind of look people give each other when they sense someone has gone a little further than the moment required. But nobody said anything because it was easier to let the sale continue than to defend a man who was not even present to defend himself. One older neighbor, a widow named Carol, who had known Silas Callaway years earlier, almost spoke up about the chest, some vague memory stirring at the sight of the stamped lettering. But the moment passed before she could find the words, and she simply moved on to the folding table of ceramic dishes instead. Ethan paid the $20, loaded the chest into the back of his pickup truck, and drove off without any real idea of what he had just carried away. Brielle felt something close to satisfaction, the particular kind of pride some people feel when they mistake spite for strength, and she sent Wyatt a short, cold text message telling him she had cleaned out his Navy garbage for him. She did not wait for a response. She simply went back to selling old dishes as though nothing important had happened at all, already imagining how good it would feel to finally close the chapter of her marriage that still lingered in that garage. Wyatt read the message during a break at the marina, his hands still stained with engine oil, and something in his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with dread. He did not shout. He did not throw his phone. He simply asked her, in a single text message sent back within seconds, who exactly she had sold it to. He drove straight to the old house after his shift ended, not to argue, but because there was one thing he had asked her never to touch, and she had touched it anyway. Brielle met him at the door with her arms crossed, telling him if the box mattered so much he should have kept it in a bank vault instead of a dirty garage. Preston stepped in behind her, adding that a real man does not come running home over a $20 crate of old junk, and the words landed exactly the way Preston intended them to, meant to shrink Wyatt down in front of people who used to know him as something more. Wyatt stayed calm despite the sting of it, because he had learned long ago that calm often carries more weight than anger ever could. He asked again, more directly this time, for the name of the man who had bought it. Brielle admitted she did not remember clearly, only that it had been some older man interested in old military junk, and the vagueness of her answer frightened Wyatt more than any specific answer could have. He knew that chest held far more than sentimental value. Inside it, sealed for decades, sat a waterproof journal, a metal identification card, and a small key meant for a long-forgotten safety deposit box, each one connected to his father, Silas Calloway, a man whose reputation had quietly collapsed after a 1981 incident that the official record blamed entirely on him. Wyatt spent the following 2 days walking the streets of Harbor Bend, stopping into second-hand shops, flea markets, and roadside stalls that specialized in old military memorabilia, asking quiet, careful questions about an oak chest with rusted hinges. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, only the steady, restless urgency of a man trying to outrun a clock he could not see. He worked his shifts at the marina during the day, since Bill's did not pause simply because his life had tilted sideways, and he spent his evenings driving from one small shop to another, showing a photograph of the chest on his phone to anyone who would look. Some shopkeepers barely glanced at the image before shaking their heads, while others studied it a little too long, the kind of attention that made Wyatt wonder whether word of the chest had already begun to travel faster than he could follow it. He called June each night to say goodnight, keeping his voice steady and warm despite the exhaustion pulling at him, unwilling to let whatever chaos surrounded the chest touch the one part of his life that still felt uncomplicated. On the second evening, standing outside a shuttered pawn shop with rain beginning to fall, Wyatt allowed himself, just for a moment, to wonder whether his father's chest was already gone for good, sold again to someone with no idea what they were holding, and the thought settled into his stomach like cold water. Meanwhile, in the back room of his small shop, Ethan Pruitt finally opened the chest to properly catalog what he had bought. Inside, there was no gold, no cash, nothing that gleamed the way treasure does in old stories. There was only a compass with a cracked glass face, a journal wrapped in thick rubber sealant, a metal card stamped with the code HL-17, and a sealed envelope closed with a smear of dried blue-green wax, the kind rarely used outside of formal government correspondence from another era entirely. Ethan, more curious than greedy, photographed a few of the items and posted them to a small online forum dedicated to maritime antiques and Navy surplus collecting, hoping simply to learn their history and perhaps their value. Within a matter of hours, the photographs reached far beyond the small community he intended, landing eventually in front of someone who quietly scouted rare historical items on behalf of a company called Waverly Maritime Holdings. At that very moment, in a glass-walled office high above the streets of New York City, a billionaire named Conrad Waverly III sat preparing for a multi-billion-dollar acquisition involving several international shipping ports. His assistant placed a printed photograph on his desk without explanation, a simple image of a metal card stamped with the code HL-17. Conrad stopped mid-sentence, set down the documents in his hand, and asked his assistant to clear the remainder of his afternoon. That code, HL-17, belonged to something his family had quietly searched for across nearly 5 decades, tied to a classified maritime initiative from 1981 known internally as Project Harbor Light. According to the official company history, the project had failed due to the negligence of a Navy technician named Silas Calloway, a story the Waverly family had repeated so many times it had calcified into accepted fact. But privately, within a very small circle, it was known that a sealed envelope connected to Harbor Light had never actually been recovered, and its disappearance had haunted 3 generations of Waverly leadership. Flake, Conrad's own grandfather, had built much of the family's maritime empire on the reputation Harbor Light eventually earned once it was quietly relaunched, years later, under a different name, its safety architecture reused across dozens of commercial contracts, without a single public mention of Silas Calloway, or the technicians who had first designed it. Conrad had grown up believing the official story completely, the tale of a brilliant Waverly innovation nearly derailed by a careless Navy man, and he had repeated it himself in interviews and shareholder meetings without ever once questioning its foundation. It was only in private conversations with his own father, years before his father's death, that Conrad had first heard a note of doubt slip through. A passing comment, suggesting the full truth of Harbor Light had never actually reached the public record. His father had died without elaborating further, leaving Conrad with nothing but a vague unease and a single handwritten instruction tucked inside a locked drawer, the same instruction his assistant had just reminded him of hours earlier. Conrad had spent years telling himself the instruction was simply an old man's caution, a business safeguard rather than a confession, but the moment he saw the photograph of that metal card, every buried doubt rose back to the surface at once. Conrad called his personal attorney, a sharp and quietly formidable woman named Marjorie Whitlock, instructing her to verify the authenticity of the chest immediately and discreetly. He did not explain the full history to his own board of directors. He simply ordered the legal team to prepare both funds and paperwork for an urgent acquisition, moving with the kind of speed usually reserved only for emergencies. Ethan received a strange phone call not long after posting the photographs, an anonymous offer to purchase the entire chest for $50,000. He nearly dropped the phone, considering he had paid only $20 for it 3 days earlier, and he had barely processed the offer when the bell above his shop door rang and Wyatt Calloway walked in. Wyatt saw the chest sitting on the counter, its familiar rusted hinges catching the afternoon light, and something in him settled and tightened at the same time. He told Ethan plainly that the chest belonged to his family, that it had never been his ex-wife's to sell, and that he had spent 2 days searching every shop in town looking for exactly this moment. Ethan did not argue or grow defensive. He explained calmly that he had purchased the chest fairly at a public yard sale, with no knowledge that it belonged to anyone unwilling to part with it. Wyatt did not blame him, understanding that Ethan's hands were clean even if Brielle's decision had not been, though he admitted he did not have anywhere near the money required to simply buy it back outright. Before either of them could settle the matter, a line of dark sedans pulled up outside the shop, and Conrad Waverly III stepped out, accompanied by Marjorie Whitlock, both moving with the unhurried confidence of people who had never once had to wait for anything in their lives. The atmosphere in the small shop shifted instantly, and Ethan understood without being told that this was no longer an ordinary transaction involving old military collectibles. Conrad studied the chest, his eyes lingering especially on the metal card marked HL-17, before turning his attention fully toward Wyatt. He asked directly whether Wyatt was connected to the Calloway family, and Wyatt answered simply that he was the son of Silas Calloway. The room went quiet for several long seconds, the kind of silence that carries the weight of decades rather than moments. Conrad offered, without hesitation, to purchase the entire chest for $5 million, payment issued the same day, on the single condition that Wyatt surrender every item inside and sign a formal agreement of permanent silence regarding its contents. Wyatt did not accept. Instead, he asked why a billionaire would offer $5 million for something his own ex-wife had just sold for $20. Conrad avoided a direct answer, while Marjorie offered only that the chest represented a historical asset connected to an old corporate matter, phrasing chosen carefully to reveal as little as possible. Wyatt understood immediately that they were not simply trying to buy back an old chest. They were trying to buy the silence of the entire Calloway family, and the price of that silence had apparently grown quite steep in 45 years. Word of the $5 million offer spread through Harbor Bend faster than Wyatt could have imagined, eventually reaching Brielle and Preston within hours. They arrived at Ethan's shop no longer laughing about junk or curses, their expressions sharpened by the sudden appearance of real money. Brielle announced immediately that since she had been the one to sell the chest, she believed she retained some rightful claim to whatever profit now surrounded it. Preston, louder and more confident than the situation warranted, insisted that Wyatt was simply benefiting from something Brielle had generously cleared out of an overcrowded garage, and he tried, somewhat clumsily, to convince Conrad to negotiate with Brielle instead. Marjorie Whitlock responded with the calm precision of a woman who had spent decades dismantling weaker arguments, asking Brielle directly whether she possessed any documentation proving legal ownership of the chest. Brielle stammered, unable to produce anything beyond the simple claim that it had been sitting in what was once her garage. Wyatt reminded everyone present, without raising his voice, that the chest was a personal inheritance from his father, entirely separate from any shared property division that had occurred during the divorce. Brielle's tone shifted almost instantly, softening into something closer to persuasion, suggesting that if Wyatt had any decency at all, he would share the money, since she was technically the one who had discovered its value. It was a small but telling reversal. The same woman who had mocked the chest as worthless garbage now attempting to reposition herself as its rightful discoverer. Wyatt did not raise his voice or indulge the argument at length. He simply told her that she had not discovered its value at all, only her own greed, and she had simply discovered it later than everyone else standing in that room. Conrad watched the confrontation unfold with quiet interest, recognizing almost immediately that Wyatt was not a man who could easily be bought or manipulated. Rather than pressing further in front of an audience, he proposed a private meeting at his attorney's office, where he promised to explain, at least partially, exactly why the chest carried such enormous weight. At Marjorie's temporary office overlooking the harbor, Conrad finally told Wyatt the story of Project Harbor Light. In 1981, Waverly Maritime had partnered with a small team of Navy technicians to design an emergency positioning system intended for commercial vessels crossing dangerous coastal waters. Silas Calloway had served as one of the lead technicians responsible for verifying the system's backup confirmation protocols before it could be approved for commercial use. According to the official record that had circulated for decades, the project collapsed because Silas lost critical data and caused significant financial damage to Waverly Maritime. Following that failure, the Calloway family lost its standing entirely, while the Waverly family quietly distanced itself from any responsibility for what had gone wrong. Conrad admitted, with visible reluctance, that his own father had once left behind a private note instructing that if a Calloway chest ever surfaced, it must be purchased immediately, before it ever reached the company's board of directors. Conrad confessed he did not know exactly what the chest contained, only that its existence had the potential to unravel the official version of events that his family had built its reputation upon. Wyatt opened his father's waterproof journal for the first time in years, revealing detailed technical notes, dated entries describing testing procedures, and a pointed account of how the Waverly leadership had pushed to commercialize the positioning system before proper safety verification had been completed. The sealed envelope, opened carefully, contained an unpublished agreement stating that if the Harbor Light system was ever used commercially, the Calloway family would be formally credited and compensated significantly. A document bearing the signature of an earlier Waverly family founder. The metal card marked HL-17 turned out to be a key code for a secondary storage vault, one that might still contain an original document confirming that Silas Calloway had never betrayed the project at all. Wyatt understood then that $5 million was never the true value of the chest. It was simply the price the Waverly family had assigned to burying the truth one more time. Conrad was, at that moment, finalizing an enormous transaction with an international coalition of ports, built directly on technology descended from the original Harbor Light framework. If old records proved that Waverly Maritime had concealed ownership disputes and wrongfully blamed Silas Calloway for their own failures, the deal could face devastating delays, public scrutiny, and possibly even collapse entirely. Marjorie advised Conrad to handle the matter with complete transparency, warning that concealment discovered later would cause far greater damage than honesty offered now. Yet several members of the Waverly board privately pushed in the opposite direction, preferring simply to buy the chest, silence Wyatt, and force him into signing whatever agreement made the entire matter disappear quietly. Betrayal and Preston, sensing an opportunity, hired their own attorney in an attempt to claim a share of the settlement, framing the entire situation as a leftover property dispute from the divorce rather than what it truly was. They hoped the pressure of legal noise might push Wyatt toward a faster, quieter resolution that included a payout for them as well. Wyatt found himself pressed from every direction at once. An ex-wife suddenly hungry for money, a billionaire eager to control a dangerous secret, a board of directors determined to buy silence, and beneath all of it, a simple desire to restore his father's name. He did not want overnight wealth. He wanted the truth to matter more than the $5 million being offered to erase it. The turning point came when Conrad invited Wyatt to a closed board meeting at Waverly headquarters, hoping to settle the matter behind carefully guarded doors. One board member, visibly unimpressed, remarked that a marina mechanic had no real leverage against a family as powerful as the Waverlys. Wyatt placed his father's old dog tag gently on the polished table and answered that his father had once believed the truth was strong enough on its own too, and his only mistake had been trusting the wrong wealthy family to honor it. Inside the Waverly boardroom, the executives pressed Wyatt to sign an agreement accepting $5 million in exchange for permanent silence, wrapping their offer in careful legal language designed to make refusal feel unreasonable. Betrayal and Preston were invited as secondary interested parties, though in truth they were only there to see where the money might eventually land. Preston tried repeatedly to sound knowledgeable about business matters, but every sentence he spoke only revealed more of his own greed. Marjorie unexpectedly interrupted the proceedings to announce the results of an initial legal review. The chest, she confirmed, belonged to Wyatt as a personal inheritance, meaning Betrayal had sold it without any legitimate ownership claim, rendering the original $20 sale legally void from a civil standpoint, though Ethan Pruitt remained blameless since he had purchased it in good faith. She then displayed scanned pages from Silas Calloway's journal, revealing that he had repeatedly warned Waverly leadership about safety verification failures, warnings that had been deliberately buried in the official record. An old signature within the documents traced directly back to an earlier generation of Waverly family leadership, connecting the cover-up across decades rather than isolating it to a single mistake. Conrad sat in prolonged silence, caught between two paths, one that preserved his family's carefully polished legacy, and one that acknowledged they had once destroyed an innocent man's reputation to protect it. Wyatt did not ask for revenge or public humiliation of the Waverly name. He asked for three specific things: a formal public statement clearing his father's name, proper historical credit for the Calloway family's role in developing the Harbor Light system, and the creation of a maritime technical scholarship fund named after Silas Calloway. Several board members pushed back hard, arguing that a public admission of wrongdoing, even one buried in decades past, would invite lawsuits from other parties who might claim similar harm from Waverly Maritime's long history of quiet cover-ups. One director suggested privately compensating Wyatt while keeping the historical record untouched, a proposal that made Marjorie's expression harden into something close to disbelief. Another board member, older than the rest and visibly uncomfortable throughout the entire meeting, finally admitted that he remembered whispers about Harbor Light from decades earlier, whispers he had chosen not to repeat at the time because doing so would have cost him his own position within the company. Wyatt listened to the arguments circle around him: financial risk, reputational exposure, shareholder confidence, each phrase designed to make the truth sound like an unaffordable luxury rather than a debt long overdue. He did not raise his voice once during the entire exchange, though the stillness in his posture carried more weight than shouting ever could have. When it was finally his turn to speak again, he reminded the room that his father had spent the rest of his life being quietly blamed for something he had actually tried to prevent, and no boardroom vote could make that debt disappear simply by staying silent a little longer. The board resisted at first, but Conrad recognized something important in the moment: a clear difference between Wyatt and the people surrounding him. Wyatt could have demanded far more than he asked for, yet he requested only the truth, nothing greater and nothing less. Following the meeting, Conrad met privately with Wyatt to speak more honestly than he had allowed himself to before. He admitted that his initial instinct had simply been damage control, an attempt to buy back the chest before it threatened the pending international deal. But after reading the journal in full, he understood that $5 million was never a fair price for the chest itself, only a painfully small price for silencing a family that had already been wronged once. Wyatt told him plainly that he held no hatred toward Conrad for his father's mistakes, but he would not allow the Waverly family to continue profiting from technology his own father had been erased from. Conrad responded with a revised offer, one where the $5 million would still be paid, not as hush money, but as an initial compensation for the Calloway family, paired with a public exoneration and an independent oversight role in the newly formed Harbor Light partnership going forward. Wyatt did not agree immediately. He insisted that every term be placed in writing and made public before the international agreement was finalized, and Conrad accepted, despite knowing it would force him into a difficult confrontation with his own board. When Brielle learned she would receive nothing from the settlement, her anger flared, and she attempted an apology, claiming she had simply never understood how important the chest truly was. Wyatt answered quietly that the issue was never her lack of understanding. The issue was how comfortable she had grown treating everything of his as worthless, long before any of this had ever happened. Wyatt, Conrad, and Marjorie eventually traveled to an old bank archive in Boston, where the code HL-17 led them to a safety deposit vault forgotten for more than 40 years. The small key from the Navy chest unlocked the outer compartment, while the code stamped onto the metal card released a secondary verification lock that had been designed specifically to require both pieces together. Inside the vault, there was no fortune waiting in gold or currency. There were only original records from Project Harbor Light, a handwritten letter from an earlier Waverly family founder, formal confirmation of Silas Calloway's true role in the project, and an audio recording captured during a private meeting held in 1981. The recording revealed that Silas had actively tried to delay the project's commercial release until proper safety testing could be completed, only to be quietly transformed into a scapegoat meant to protect the Waverly family's public reputation. Conrad listened to the recording in complete silence, confronting for the first time a version of his family that was far less flawless than the one he had grown up believing in. He did not collapse into visible distress. He simply sat still, like a man who had just lost a piece of something he once trusted completely. Wyatt held the confirmation bearing his father's name, and though he did not break down in tears, his hands trembled slightly as he read it. He had spent his entire life hearing his father described as the man who ruined an important project, and now, finally, the truth sat plainly in front of him in black and white. He thought of all the years his father had worked quiet, thankless repair jobs around Harbor Bend, never once complaining, never once explaining himself to neighbors who whispered behind his back, and Wyatt understood now that his father's silence had never been guilt. It had simply been the silence of a man who had already learned that no one with money was interested in hearing the truth from someone without any. He thought too of June, and how someday he would be able to tell her honestly who her grandfather really was, not as a cautionary tale whispered at the diner, but as a man who had tried, quietly and at great personal cost, to do the right thing when it mattered most. Marjorie confirmed that this evidence alone was strong enough to reshape every term of the upcoming international agreement, and Conrad made the decision to disclose the truth publicly, both to his own board and to the international partners waiting on the deal. At the public announcement that followed, Waverly Maritime Holdings formally acknowledged that its historical record of Project Harbor Light had been seriously incomplete. The name Silas Calloway was restored publicly as one of the essential technical minds behind the original safety framework, undoing nearly 45 years of quiet erasure. Wyatt attended the announcement as an official representative of the Calloway family. Dressed simply but neatly, his composure standing in sharp contrast to the discomfort visible on Brielle and Preston's faces from the back row. Brielle had once sold that chest for $20 without a second thought, and now she watched Conrad sign a formal settlement worth $5 million, along with public documentation restoring the Calloway family's honor. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that what she had thrown away was never simply an old wooden box, but the last surviving piece of a man's dignity that she had once dismissed without hesitation. Preston attempted to leave the event early, visibly uncomfortable, since every mocking comment he had made about Wyatt's worthless junk had folded back sharply onto his own arrogance. Ethan Pruitt attended as well, and Wyatt thanked him personally for refusing to sell the chest elsewhere once the situation had grown serious. Conrad, in turn, offered Ethan a fair compensation of his own, acknowledging the honest role he had played throughout the entire unfolding story. There was satisfaction in the moment, though not cruelty. Brielle was not destroyed or ruined publicly. She simply had to live with the quiet knowledge that her own contempt had cost her everything she might have gained, while granting Wyatt something she never expected him to receive. In the weeks that followed the announcement, Brielle found herself explaining the story over and over to people who wanted every detail. Neighbors who had once laughed along with her at the yard sale now asking careful, curious questions about the chest she had sold for $20. She discovered there was no comfortable way to tell the story that did not eventually circle back to her own mistake, and she grew tired of watching people's expressions shift. The moment they realized she was the woman who had thrown away a piece of history without a second thought. Preston, for his part, quietly stopped bringing up the chest at all, preferring instead to let the entire episode fade as quickly as possible from anyone's memory, including his own. Ethan Pruitt's small antiques shop saw a modest but steady increase in customers after the story became known locally. People curious to see the man who had once, however briefly, held something worth millions in the back room of his store. He never allowed the attention to change how he ran his business, still selling chipped china and second-hand furniture with the same quiet care he always had, though he kept a single photograph of the restored chest framed near his register as a reminder of how easily value can hide inside something the world has already decided to overlook. Several weeks later, Wyatt returned to his ordinary life at the marina, though ordinary now carried a different weight than before. He did not transform his life into a display of sudden wealth. He used part of the settlement to secure a stable future for his daughter June, and another portion to establish a small technical training program for young people in Harbor Bend who could not otherwise afford a traditional college education. The old Navy chest was carefully restored, though Wyatt refused to have it polished beyond recognition. He kept the salt-stained wood, the rusted hinges, and the small imperfections intact, because those very details proved it had survived a long and difficult journey. Conrad later sent Wyatt a copy of the new Harbor Light Partnership Agreement, one where Silas Calloway's name appeared clearly in the historical foundation of the technology, exactly the acknowledgement Wyatt had wanted from the very beginning. The training program Wyatt established grew slowly but steadily over the following months, filling a modest workshop near the marina with young people from Harbor Bend and the surrounding towns who had never imagined a technical career was within their reach. He taught some of the classes himself in the evenings, showing teenagers how to read an engine the way his own father had once taught him, patiently without shortcuts, insisting that understanding a machine meant respecting it first. Conrad, to the surprise of several board members, quietly arranged for Waverly Maritime to fund equipment and scholarships for the program going forward, a gesture Wyatt accepted not as an apology, but as a debt finally being paid in the right direction. Marjorie Whitlock stayed in occasional contact with Wyatt after the settlement was finalized, impressed by a man who had held enormous leverage in his hands and used almost none of it for himself. She once told a colleague that in nearly 30 years of practicing law, she had rarely watched someone walk away from that much money still standing taller than when they arrived. Wyatt never thought of it that way. He simply believed that some debts could not be measured in dollars, and his father's name had always been worth more to him than any number Conrad Waverly could have written on a check. In a quiet moment, near the end of it all, June asked her father why that old chest mattered so much to him. Wyatt did not explain every complicated detail of what had happened. He simply told her that some things look old and worthless on the outside, yet they quietly hold on to a truth that other people would rather forget. She asked if she could keep the compass someday, the one with the cracked glass face that had sat inside the chest for over 40 years, and Wyatt promised her that when she was old enough to understand the whole story, the entire chest would belong to her. He did not say it to be sentimental. He said it because he wanted her to grow up believing that quiet people who tell the truth eventually get heard, even if it takes decades longer than it should, and even if the world spends most of that time treating them like something not worth $20. He placed his father's dog tag back inside the chest and closed the lid gently, the hinge creaking the same way it always had. The chest was no longer a burden carried quietly from the past. It stood now as proof that even after being sold for almost nothing, real honor can still find its way back home, carried not by luck or money, but by a son who refused to let his father's name stay buried under someone else's convenient version of the truth.